Hello, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. So we'll just wait a minute for everyone to join. Yeah, while we are waiting, can you just let me know where you're calling in from? So I'm calling in from Zagreb, Croatia, and I'd like to know where you are calling in from. So if you can just let me know the city and the country where you're from, just for me to get a better feeling on where from everyone is joining to this webinar. Anyway, while I'm waiting for your feedback, just a couple of announcements here. So first of all, we are recording this webinar. So if you joined the webinar through LinkedIn or YouTube, you will actually be able to find it on the same page where you're watching the live streaming now. And if you join the webinar through Zoom, then you will be able actually to see the webinar on the same page where you actually registered for the webinar on 𝗧𝗿𝗲𝗁 website. So it's up to you to actually define where you want to see this, but in any case the webinar will be recorded. Second thing is you'll be able to download this presentation deck from this today's webinar, and at the end of the webinar today I'll tell you where you can download this presentation deck. So if you can stick to the end of the webinar, you'll find out where to download it. Okay, so I think we can start. So welcome to the webinar how to set the ISMS scope according to ISO 27001. My name is 𝗹𝗲𝗴𝗶𝘀𝗁 and I'm the main ISO 27001 expert at 𝗧𝗿𝗲𝗁, and 𝗧𝗿𝗲𝗁 is a company that makes compliance easy to understand and simple to use. And this webinar today is, as I mentioned, streamed through Zoom, but also through LinkedIn and YouTube, and it will last approximately 50, maybe 16 minutes. And this really depends on the number of questions that you'll have during the webinar. And by all means, please do send as many questions as you want, because this way the webinar will be more interesting, and of course you'll get the direct answers to whatever you're interested in. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide. So basically, why is this topic of setting the scope important? Well, it's important because this is something that you do basically at the beginning of your project, and if you actually do this in a wrong way, if you set the scope in a wrong way, then the whole project actually could take much longer and would take actually much more would actually require much more resources than if actually you set the whole scope in the beginning right. So doing this right at the very beginning is very important, actually, not to actually pay the price, so to say, later on. And yeah, of course, during the webinar I'll show how to set the scope that is appropriate for your company, for your circumstances. And basically this webinar today is intended both for companies that are implementing this that are implementing ISO 27001, but also for consultants that are consulting their clients on how to implement ISO 27001. All right, so basically my main point today is that when thinking about the ISMS scope, and the purpose of the ISMS scope is that you actually have to define what data, what information in your company you want to focus on protecting, right? So basically what is, let's say, the most important, the most sensitive data that you have in your company and that you want to focus on. This is basically what it means to set the ISMS scope. And basically parallel to this, what ISMS scope does not mean, it does not mean that you actually are setting your controls or safeguards on which controls or safeguards are applicable and which are not. So setting the scope is different from defining which controls are applicable or which are not. And actually during the webinar I'll explain the differences between the two. I'll actually show you in which part of the process of the implementation you set the scope and in which part you actually define which controls are applicable. Okay, yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So let's see the agenda for today. First, I'll show you actually how you document this scope, so basically, and why basically this is needed. Also, I'll go through this question of dependencies and interfaces which are required by ISO 27001. I'll show you actually a couple of examples on how to do this. I'll also show you what is the process of defining the ISMS scope, what steps do you need to take. I'll also show you a couple of examples of how to define the scope if you have servers in the cloud, which basically most companies do, and this is very often a dilemma on how to deal with this. And also how you actually handle security if within your scope, if actually your data is handled by third parties like suppliers, I don't know, cloud providers, these kind of companies. And I'll have this Q&A session at the end. And by the way, you do not have to wait for this Q&A session to actually ask your question. So as I go through the presentation, you can ask your question, and I'll try to answer the question right away so that you don't wait till the Q&A. Yeah, okay. So, and by the way, you can actually let me know through the chat window if you want me to focus on any of these topics. So if you find any of these topics, let's say, more interesting, then let me know, and then I'll spend more time during the webinar on those topics. And yeah, when sending me messages, if you joined through LinkedIn or YouTube, simply send a message through the chat window, whereas if you join the webinar through Zoom, then you have this Q&A pane. Okay, so let's see, where actually do you define this scope? The first one is in the ISMS scope document, okay? And this is where you actually provide a detailed description. So this is where you actually describe, you know, what departments do you cover, processes, I don't know, technologies, these kind of things. Yeah, later on in the webinar, I'll show you a couple of examples on what you what you must include, what you should not include. I'll also show you an example of ISMS scope document. I'll do this later on in the webinar. Basically, the second document where the scope is visible is actually in the ISO 27000 certificate. So when your company goes for ISO 27000 certification, when you pass this certification, which I hope you will, the certification body will issue this certificate, and in this certificate it will actually show a shorter version of what your scope is. Because the certification bodies are obliged to actually specify what did they certify, right? If they certify your whole company or only one part of your company. And by the way, if you're interested in this topic about ISO 27000 certification, you can take a look at this article, and we'll share now the link to this article called How to Get ISO 27000 Certified. So when you click this link, you will see this article on the 𝗧𝗲𝗴𝗶 website. And by the way, if you join the webinar through YouTube or through Zoom, then you can simply click this link and it will open in your browser. Whereas if you join the webinar through LinkedIn, then because of some limitations, internal limitations in LinkedIn, you can't actually click this link. And the way and the workaround for this is that you simply copy the URL and paste it into your browser, and then this link, and basically then you will see this article open in your browser. Okay, yeah, I see a question from Vicky coming in. I'm interested in how do you determine what should be included or excluded from the ISMS scope in real-world implementations. Okay, I'll actually go through this and I'll explain basically what you could do. Actually, I can give you an example right now. So, for example, let's say that I don't know, let's say that you are a large pharmaceutical company, okay? And when these larger companies are determining the scope, usually they go only for a smaller scope, so they do not go for the whole company because it would be simply too big. And in this case, a pharmaceutical company should focus on where the most sensitive information is. And this could actually be, for example, the R&D department, research and development department. because this kind of pharmaceutical companies, the most sensitive information is actually in these laboratories or whatever they are using for research and development, because they are actually discovering all these new formulas or these new I don't know, medications and all of these things. So basically this is where actually they have the most sensitive information, and for pharmaceutical company it might make sense actually to include this R&D department in the scope. There are various other examples of setting the scope. Very often companies go for only their IT department, because this is where obviously most of this information, most of this data is processed. You might actually have, I don't know, a financial institution that actually might include, let's say, the departments that are related to where they handle the private customers, or let's say where they handle the most sensitive customers, these kind of things. Mostly the companies that actually work, that use our products, these are usually companies that are dealing with the cloud, so they're providing cloud products and services. If they are smaller companies, they typically include their whole company in the scope, so let's say up to 50 employees. But if they are larger companies, and again, if they are providing some cloud services, cloud products, then they typically include in the scope the department where they actually have that takes care of the production environment, so let's say DevOps or something like this, but also the software development department, customer support, these kind of things. Okay, now let me see, let's go for the next slide. And basically when you write this detailed document for ISMS scope, what you should be including and what you should not be including. So what you typically include are the processes, okay? And let's say departments. So let's say that you have, okay, let's say that you include software development department in your scope. In this case, software development department might have several processes within it. One process might be simply, you know, the coding. Second, I mean, developing the software code, right? The second process within might be the QA, where basically you're checking the quality of the code, you're testing these kind of things. So you might also have, of course, some other, you might have actually a process of uploading this code into a repository, these kind of things. So basically one department might have several processes, and this is actually how you can describe your scope, both in terms of departments and processes. But you should also define the scope in terms of locations, right? So basically on which physical locations do you have your offices or similar. If your employees are working remotely, if they're working from home, then you can actually specify that, you know, I don't know, out of your, let's say 100 people, 100 employees, let's say that 34 are working remotely from their home. So of course you would not specify their home addresses, you would simply say that they're working from their home office, whereas the majority of people, let's say, work on these specific locations. What you should also specify are some exclusions. These exclusions could be, let's say, the, I don't know, temporary employees that you might have, like, I don't know, students, these kind of things. But you might also want to specify that you are excluding a certain type of equipment. For example, if employees are using their private devices, or let's say private smartphones, then typically you would exclude these kind of devices. Okay, what is typically not acceptable to define the scope is in terms of products. So let's say that a company provides some kind of an application, I mean SaaS application, that they're selling this kind of a product on the markets. You cannot actually define the scope in terms of a product, because this is a limitation by certification bodies. And so basically you should define, let's say that you have this online product. The way to work around this is that you define what departments are supporting this product and then you actually define these the scope in terms of these departments. You should also not define the scope only in terms of technology. So you cannot say that your scope is, I don't know, only the server. Again, it's not going to work. You have to define the departments, the processes that support this server. And again, as I mentioned before, you cannot define in your scope which controls which controls from the Annex A are included in a scope or excluded. So this is something that is not defined in the scope document. Okay, good. Now let me move on to this dilemma on when you actually define the ISMS scope and when do you define which controls are included and excluded. So basically you start first with this definition of requirements from interested parties. And just to explain this better and a little bit more and why this is important. So interested parties are typically, when it comes to cybersecurity, they're typically either, let's say, government, and basically government by through various laws and regulations. Okay, this is one type of interested party, and the second interested party are customers. Okay. Now, the government could simply define that you need to include in your scope certain activities of your company. Sometimes this is possible. It's not very often, but sometimes in some cases you might have this kind of situation. For example, GDPR in Europe defines that you need to provide protection for personal data, basically for all the personal data that you're handling in a company, right? And then because of GDPR, it might actually make sense that you're implementing ISO 27001 anywhere that you process personal data. Again, GDPR doesn't say that you have to implement 27001. There is no such requirement. But if you want to actually, if the intention of your company is to cover all the security aspects of GDPR using ISO 27001, which by the way, a lot of companies do, then actually you need to cover in the scope basically all the activities, all the processes, all the departments in your company where personal data is processed. Another basically input or another type of interested parties are customers, as I mentioned. And you might actually have a customer that is demanding that you actually cover with the ISMS a specific part of your company because they want to make sure that that specific part of your company is secure. Okay. In this case, you actually have to take into account this kind of requirements and then apply the scope on this using this kind of criteria. Okay, and then the next step is basically that you define the ISMS scope. Again, you define the scope in terms of processes, departments, physical addresses, these kind of things. And then I'll just go through our next couple of steps just to show you when actually you define and select the controls that are applicable and that are not applicable. Then you have to define this top-level information security policy. This is a top-level document which provides direction. And then you actually define, then you go through the risk assessment and treatment. This is where you actually assess all the risks and find which controls are, let's say, necessary for those risks. And by the way, we'll send you now two links to two articles. The first one is an article called How to Identify ISMS Requirements of Interested Parties. So if you want to, let's say, learn more about how these interested parties and their requirements work, you can take a look at this article. And the second one, the second article is called ISO 27000 Risk Assessment, Treatment and Management, the Complete Guide. You'll see that this is one very lengthy article. It explains in more detail how do you actually perform a risk assessment and treatment. Okay, and then actually as the fifth step here comes this statement of applicability. Now, statement of applicability is a mandatory document, and in this document you actually define, you actually list all the 93 controls from the Annex A, and then from each control, for each control you define which control is applicable and which is not applicable. Okay, and basically the criteria to define which control is applicable and which is not is based on the risk assessment. So if you have high risks, then you have to apply controls, but you also have to take into account the requirements of interested parties that I've displayed here in the first step. Okay, so these are the two most important inputs when you define which controls are applicable, and this is done in the statement of applicability. So what I wanted to show you here is that the selection of which controls are applicable and which are not is done in this fifth step, not in the beginning when you define the ISMS scope. These are two completely different, let's say, activities, two completely different documents, two completely different, I would say, logic on how you actually do this. All right, now let me move on. We'll also send you now this link to this article, Statement of Applicability in ISO 27001, and why does it matter, so you can actually learn more about this document in this article. Okay, now just a couple of tips here on when you actually start writing this and start doing this ISMS scope. And, you know, my main point here is that you should not do this, you should not make it too complicated, because, you know, very often I see companies that are making a big philosophy out of this ISMS scope document, and then they write it on, I don't know, 5 or 10 pages. They actually start writing into it, you know, these internal, external issues, I don't know, dependencies, interfaces, so on. And basically these things are not needed, so you do not have to document them. And just let me show you this. So what is usually not documented in the related to ISO 27001 are these internal and external issues, dependencies, and interfaces. And list of assets usually is documented, but not list of assets usually is allowed, but is documented, but it's not something that is written in the ISMS scope document. You actually list the assets later on. So when we speak about these internal and external issues, dependencies, interfaces, the standard does require that you take them into account, but ISO 27001 does not require you to write them down. Okay, so my recommendation is, especially if you are a smaller company, don't write these dependencies, interfaces, internal and external issues. You have to think about them when you define the scope, but don't actually write them down. This will only slow you down. Okay, now actually let me show you another thing that might be useful to you. So I'll switch the screen to this article here. So you actually have one article, bigger article on Advisor website. Is called Big Guide to ISO 27001 clauses, how it is standard structured. And basically when you scroll down, you will see that all the clauses from ISO 27001 are listed here, together with all the Annex A controls. So you will see that all the 93 controls are here. And for example, if you want to see how each of these look like, so if I open this control here, I see a detailed explanation. So basically you see the explanation of the control, which documents you might use to cover this control. You will see the implementation, how this is done, and you also will see the audit evidence. So basically anything that an auditor might be looking for. But what is more important here is that to show you that actually this clause 4.3 is also covered, the clause that defines what is necessary for ISMS scope. And here you can actually see again the explanation and the boundaries of the ISMS, considering internal and external issues and internal parties requirements, as well as the existing interfaces and dependencies. Okay. Documentation, this ISMS scope document, you have here the steps that are needed, and again the audit evidence. Okay, so we'll send you now the link to this big guide to ISO 27001 clauses, and you can open this on your own just to go through these things. Now let me show you in the next slide what are these dependencies and interfaces, and why they're important. Why is it important to consider them when you actually think about setting the scope? Okay, so here in this diagram you see, let's say, a hypothetical company A, where in the scope of the ISMS you actually include a couple of core processes, and then you have some supporting processes. Again, core processes could be, I don't know, again, as I mentioned, coding, I mean developing the software codes, QA, I mean checking and testing the code, the developed code, I don't know, again, uploading this code. So all these things could be core processes, and supporting processes could be as simple as, I don't know, sales, marketing, customer support, these kind of things. Now, let's assume that okay, software development maybe not be a very good example here, but let's say that this company has legal services outsourced. Okay, so they're using an external lawyer to help them with any legal issues. So basically, this is an external service. Obviously, this is not going to be within the ISMS scope. Or you might have, I don't know, cleaning services, right? Cleaning lady, or you might have accounting services. So especially if you're a smaller company, you will have outsourced all of these things. Now, what is the dependency here? Basically, your company, company A, depends on the legal services, on the cleaning services, on accounting services, because you wouldn't be able actually, okay, you might be able to clean your offices, but you probably wouldn't be able to, you know, define all the contracts and do the accounting, because this is usually too complicated for, you know, someone, for a layman to do. So obviously this is something that you outsource, so you depend on these outsourced services. So dependency is as easy as that. Now interface is basically what is kind of standing between you and these external services. And basically for all of these, for let's say legal services, accounting services, the interface is basically, you're usually communicating through telephone, through email. So basically it's again, this is an interface through which you communicate. Now these interfaces are more important when you are actually having a scope that is not your whole company, when you actually have only one department in your scope. So let's say that you have one location, and in this location you have 3 departments, but in this actually location only one department is within the scope and 2 departments are not within in the scope. And in this case, the interface between this department that is within the scope and these 2 departments that are outside of the scope are, let's say, sometimes simply the office walls, right? The employees of one department are sitting in one office, and the other 2 departments, the employees are sitting in other offices. In this case, the interface is basically the walls and the doors that is between the departments that are in the scope and outside of the scope. You could also have a separate network, right? That you actually have segregated network, and that basically the departments within the scope are working on the part of the network which is segregated from the others. And in this case, the interface is some kind of a network device that stands in between, right? So these are basically the interfaces that are that you have to consider. Why are they important? You actually have to take them into account to see if these interfaces are, I would say, good enough to segregate these 2, let's say the department that is within the scope and the department that is outside of the scope. So for example, if all the departments are using the same local network without segregation, then this scope would be harder to separate. It would be harder to separate these employees that are, let's say, in the scope from the employees that are outside of the scope. If all the employees are sitting within the same office, right, there is no separation between them, again, it will be much harder to actually include only a part of these employees in the scope and all the others outside of the scope. So this is why you actually have to first understand these dependencies, right? Who depends on what, and then the interfaces between the, let's say, things that are in the scope and the things that are outside of the scope. Again, these interfaces are very easy when you actually use an external service. but these interfaces become very important when you actually are having a part of your let's say company in the scope and part of your company outside of the scope. Okay, and by the way, let me just show you one thing here from LinkedIn. I posted a week ago, what is your biggest challenge when it comes to setting the ISMS scope, and it's dependencies and interfaces. So this is really the biggest challenge. 41% actually of people answered that this is the biggest challenge. The second biggest challenge is whether to cover the whole company or not. And then some other smaller challenges, documenting the scope and securing data outside of the scope. So yes, these interfaces and dependencies are something that let's say puzzles most people, but you know, when you actually start thinking about it, then it's not actually so complicated. Okay, we'll also send you now a link to an article. It's called All You Need to Know About Setting the ISMS Scope. And there you can actually read in more detail all the things that I've mentioned in today's webinar, but also you can see a section about these interfaces and dependencies. Okay, now there is a dilemma actually whether to include your whole company in the scope or not. And again, I like to have a very simple kind of criteria here. And for me, the criteria is the number of employees. So if the company is less than 50 employees, has less than 50 employees, then I would typically tend to suggest that the whole company is included in the scope. Okay. Whereas if it is a larger company, more than 50 employees, then I think it's easier actually to select only one part of your company and include only this one part in your company and go for the implementation. Of course, let's say that you are, I don't know, 1,000 employees and that you include, okay, let's say this pharmaceutical company, let's say that they have 50 employees in the R&D department. You start with the R&D department, include only those 50 employees in the scope. Of course, it doesn't mean that you have to leave it at that. You can actually expand this scope later on and you know, then include another department, and so on. And ultimately, in a couple of years, you can actually reach your whole company scope. And if you go actually this kind of step by step, it will be much easier for you than if you try to actually include right away all the 1,000 employees in the scope. Why is this so? Because it's easier to learn how to implement ISO 27001 on a smaller scope rather than trying to implement it for your whole larger company. Again, if you are smaller than 50 employees, it's easier to do for the whole company, because for such small companies, it's very hard to actually separate part of the employees outside of the scope because of these you know, interfaces, dependencies. Then it's better to actually include everything in the scope for these smaller companies. Anyway, company size smaller or larger than 50 employees. This is, let's say, the first criteria there. Then, again, if you're smaller than 50, then you go for the whole scope. But if you're larger than 50 employees, then you should consider where your more sensitive information is. Okay. In case of, again, a pharmaceutical company, this might be the R&D scope. You also have to consider the requirements of interested parties. Again, what your customers say or require, what the government requires. Think about what are the dependencies, and think about if the interfaces are clear enough. Okay, and then basically when you go through these steps, then you can actually define what the scope in your company is. Okay, we'll also share now a link to a YouTube video. It's called How to Set the ISO 27001 Scope. So if you prefer actually watching videos rather than reading articles, then you can take a look at this YouTube video where I explain also how to set the scope, also the steps to define the scope. So you might find this useful. Okay, now let's see. Let me just check if there are any questions coming in. So I don't think so. Okay, very well. what happens if your actually servers are in the cloud? So you're hosting your, I don't know, software development servers or I don't know, production servers or whatever you have. You might use, I don't know, Microsoft Azure, or you might be using Amazon AWS or something else. It doesn't matter. But let's say that you're using cloud, that you're hosting your virtual or any kind of servers in the cloud. So the dilemma, of course, there is that is this part of the scope or not? And I would say this depends on whether you can, what you should include in the scope depends on what you control. And typically what you can control, you are including in the scope, and what you cannot control, you are excluding this from the scope. So let's take a couple of examples here, and let me just show you. So let's say that you have your own physical server on a third-party infrastructure. So you're simply installing your own a physical server into some kind of a data center. In this case, you actually control the hardware, okay? You control also this software, and you control the data. And then you can actually include those things in your ISMS scope. However, you are not controlling the data center, because this is obviously provided by a third party. You're also not controlling the telecom links. They're also provided by a third party. So these things you're actually excluding from the scope. Okay, when we go for the next row here, virtual servers in a third-party computing infrastructure, public so infrastructure as a service, right? In this case, so you're simply hosting your virtual server, let's say on Amazon AWS. In this case, you do control the virtual server, okay? I mean software, and you do control the data, but you do not control the hardware, right? Because the hardware, the physical servers are provided by Amazon. Also, you're not controlling the data center, you're not controlling the I don't know, telecom links. So all of these things you're excluding from the scope. You're including only what you can control. And again, this is a virtual server, meaning the software, and you're controlling your data. You might be using a third-party platform, public platform as a service. Again, you're including in the scope what you can control, data and application software. Or the last row here, you're, let's say, using third-party software as a service. For example, this could be, I don't know, Zoom, this could be Gmail, this could be, I don't know, Microsoft Office 365. In this case, you're not controlling the servers, you're not controlling the data center, but you're not controlling the software either. The only thing that you are controlling in these cases is the data itself. In this case, basically only the data you can put into the ISMS scope. So again, depending on the type of a cloud service you're using or the type of the server you're using, you can include more or less in the ISMS scope. Okay, good. Now let me move on to the next slide. And this is, very often a question is, very often companies are puzzled, if they include in the ISMS scope, let's say one department, how do they actually control or how do they ensure the security of the data that is handled outside of the scope, right? Okay, for example, you're using Gmail, right? And then when you actually start sending some kind of sensitive data through Gmail, how do you actually protect it, right? And let me explain you how this works. Let's say that you have this kind of setting. You have a company, and inside the scope you only have one department, department X, okay? And outside of this scope you have three departments, department 1, 2, and 3 within the company. So this is within the same legal entity, okay? But these three departments are outside of the scope. And you also have three suppliers, supplier A, B, and C. They're all outside of the scope, okay? Now, basically, let's first of all think about how you actually handle security within the scope. You are actually doing this by applying all of these security controls, okay, controls from the Annex A. As I mentioned, there are 93 controls. You are selecting which of them are applicable, and basically this is how you decrease the risks. You can apply all of these controls within your scope because this is what you control, right? This is something that you are actually free to introduce any kind of security measures that you consider are appropriate, and basically this is how it works within the scope. Okay, and by the way, if you want to learn more about these NXA controls, there is another YouTube video where I explain how to implement these NXA controls, and we'll share now the link through the chat window. Okay, now this was easy, right? Now, how do we actually secure your data when it is processed by a third party, right, by suppliers? So let's say that you're using, I don't know, accounting services, and of course you're sending I don't know, sensitive data about your, let's say, about your wages, about your salaries. So that when you actually send this data about your salaries to your accountant, actually the data about the salaries is going basically to a third party. But how do you then actually protect this data while actually it's being processed outside of the outside of your scope? Then you actually apply these security clauses in agreements, right? Then you basically sign an agreement with your accountant where you say, okay, you have to use this and this and this kind of security measures because this is how we want you actually to protect our personal data, our salaries that you're processing, okay? You might also use some kind of terms and conditions which basically apply to all, let's say, all users. And this is especially important when you use, okay, Gmail or Microsoft Azure, or I don't know, Microsoft Office 365. Basically, you cannot force these kind of big companies to implement some security measures, but they typically publish terms and conditions where they actually explain what kind of security measures they are implementing. So in this case, when you don't have these security clauses, you're actually they need to follow their own terms and conditions where they explain all of these things. Of course, it's up to you to decide whether this is good enough for you or not. In some cases, people simply say, okay, the risks of actually using this kind of cloud service is too high. We cannot know for sure what, I don't know, Amazon is doing, so we'll switch to another provider which is more willing actually to go after what we require in terms of security. Okay, now what happens when you have these departments within the company that are not part of your scope, right? So we have one department within the scope, and then you have 3 departments outside of the scope. How do you handle actually security in this case? Typically, you would not sign agreements with the departments in the same company. Rather, you would actually simply implement company-wide policies and procedures. And these policies and procedures are then not applying only to the scope. These policies and procedures, I mean security policies and procedures, then apply to also these other departments outside of the scope. So this is basically how you enforce security to these other departments that are outside of the scope. You can also use some kind of written protocols, and I don't mean any technical protocols. I mean the kind of written organizational protocols where you basically internally agree with these departments outside of the scope on how actually what kind of security measures they need to implement. So this is basically how you enforce security within your company for the departments that are outside of the scope. And then there is also one question very often about how you perform actually the risk assessment. Do you perform the risk assessment only within your scope, or do we actually assess the risks also for these other suppliers and departments that are outside of the scope? And the answer is actually that you actually have to perform the risk assessment not only on the, let's say, assets within the scope. You also have to assess the risks of these suppliers, and you also have to assess the risks of these departments that are outside of the scope. Now, why do you need to do this, and how to avoid an overkill there? First of all, let me explain you why this risk assessment is important. You can't really know what kind of security you are going to require of your supplier unless you know what the risks are, okay? So for example, you might see, you might actually assess the risk that there is a high risk that you will lose, I don't know, certain data that is being processed in the cloud by a cloud provider, and then you actually can, I don't know, enforce this supplier to do some kind of specific backup, or you could actually back up this data with another cloud provider. So all of these things, all of these decisions are actually possible if you are aware what kind of risks are there with your suppliers. Or if your, I don't know, accountant is processing your salaries, then you also know what kind of risks can happen there, and then you can actually insert a certain security clauses in the agreements. So this is why you have to do this risk assessment, not only for the assets within the scope, but also for these suppliers. Same thing is valid for these departments that are outside of the scope. Now the difference here is that when you actually assess the risks within the scope, you should list all the assets, that are there, and then list, you know, threats and vulnerabilities, so basically that you actually have a good picture of what is happening, what kind of risks you have. Whereas for these suppliers and these departments outside of the scope, you are not really listing all of their assets. You're simply listing all the services that they are providing towards you, right? So again, in the case of this, you know, accounting supplier, you're basically listing only the I don't know, the processing of the salaries as the service, and basically then you're assessing the risks only to this service. You're not listing all of their assets in their company because you probably don't know what kind of assets they're using. Okay, yeah, so these are basically the most common dilemmas and most common questions that are coming related to this scope. Let me now show you one tool that you can use actually for handling ISO 27001 implementation, but also setting the scope, and this is 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. So 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is basically ISO 27001 software, so it's a software that helps you implement the standard. It takes you actually through all of the steps, so you can see here there are several steps needed, and I'm not going to go in the steps here. I just wanted to show you that basically what 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 can do for you. And it's usually used by companies, very small companies, from a couple of employees all the way to 200 employees. So this is basically how this 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 software is made for this kind of this size of the company. Now, one of the steps here is this ISMS scope document, and I'll show you this in a separate module, in a separate tab, how it works. So for each document in 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 has all the documents that are needed for ISO 27001, and I'll show you actually how this wizard works for these documents and how you can actually edit these documents. And for example, here for this ISMS scope document, it asks you several questions. What is the unique code for this document? Okay, I entered something here. What is the name of the person to approve this document? What is the confidentiality level? I move on to the next step. What job titles should have the access here? So I don't know, heads of the departments, IT employees. By the way, you notice that this wizard is already entering some information here, and this is because I use this wizard also for some other documents, so it already anticipates actually my responses there. What departments will be included in the ISMS scope? Okay, so here I have to specify, let's say, okay, R&D department. And by the way, here you also have some kind of textual description, so it gives you a kind of an idea of what could be included. What processes will be included here? I don't know, discovery of new whatever formulas, something like this. I never worked in a pharmaceutical company. I'm not sure how they work there. Anyway, what locations you were, specify an address here, and then move on to the next step. Which IT infrastructure will be included in the scope? So let's say this is Office 365. You move next. What will be excluded? Let's say, I don't know, temporary workers. Next step. And yeah, let's create a document, and you will see now in the next screen where actually this document is created. So when I scroll down briefly here, you will actually see the full text of this document. It already inserted this logo. It also inserts here your company name, and you have the whole document here. So I'll just browse quickly through it, and you see the definition of the scope, departments. You see it already inserted this R&D department. You also have these comments which guide you. When you simply do not need this comment, you simply delete it. And the important thing is that you can actually edit the document. So you basically say, okay, I want the R&D department and IT department. You can simply continue working here. So the processes are included here. So let me discovery of new formulas and I don't know, IT support, something like that. And so on and so forth. So basically, and then this is basically how you write the document. It makes these writing of these documents very, very easy. And simply when you're done, you simply send it for a review of your colleagues and then for approval and move on. So it's very easy. This is the point. Yeah, Conformio also has not only all the documents, it also has these risk register, statement of applicability, and so on and so forth. So it's basically something that you can use for speeding up the implementation. And yeah, we'll send you now a link to this Conformio software, so you can actually sign up for this 14-day free trial, so you can test out all the functionalities and then decide if this is something that makes sense for you. Okay, good. Now let me move on to the biggest challenges, and then I'll move on to the Q&A session. Okay, one of the biggest challenges is a definition of this scope for SaaS solutions. And as I explained, the most important thing there is to define what you can control, and then what you control you can actually include in your scope. A second challenge is usually agreeing with the company what are the most critical parts to be included in the scope. And there you actually have to follow this logic of where you have the most sensitive information, where you have the most sensitive data, because typically this is where you would focus your scope. Or actually criteria before this, you actually have to ask your customers what they consider the most important part to focus on. If they have no preference, then you basically choose on your own based on the sensitivity of the data. Another challenge, the approach, if you should define it by departments or by assets or by services. My suggestion here is that you go by departments, is the easiest, the quickest. You could also go by not by assets. You can also go by processes, but then it makes it more complicated. So if you start by departments, it's easier. If the whole organization should be scope or only some entities, I mean, you should go for your whole company. If you're a small company, up to 50 employees. If you're larger, then only some of these departments. Okay, very well. Let's move on then, just to make a short conclusion here, and then we'll go for the Q&A. So as you can see, if you define the scope correctly at the very beginning of your project, then you will not go too wide or too narrow with your implementation, and that will save you, I would say, quite a lot of time. And of course, for that purpose, you can use Conformio software, and again, you can use the link for signing up for the free trial. Alternatively, if you want our colleague to show you a demo of Conformio, then you can use this a meeting link to schedule a call with our colleague, and then actually he will take you through the whole software, and you will be able to see how this works. So either you try it yourself through a free trial or schedule this free demo call. Okay, great. Basically this is it. So let me go through the Q&A session. So I'll start answering the questions if you have them. So please do send me any questions now, and then I'll answer them. And while I'm waiting for your questions, let me go through a couple of notes here. So first of all, feel free to reach out to me directly, and so you'll see my email address on the screen now, so you can simply use this email address and send me a question directly. Second, you can follow me on LinkedIn and on YouTube. So on LinkedIn, I publish regularly various materials on ISO 27001 and also some other cybersecurity standards. So if you want to keep up to date, then follow my LinkedIn profile. On YouTube, I publish lots of videos on ISO 27001 or also on some other standards. So you can actually take a look my YouTube profile as well. And if you're a consultant, then you might find my podcast, which is called Secure and Simple. You might find it useful because this is where I interview other consultants, successful consultants, and there you can actually learn how to become a successful consultant yourself. So if you're interested in this consulting topic, you actually can take a look at this podcast. Okay, and the third thing, my next webinar will be on what is ISO 42001, and 42001 is AI governance standard, and basically in this webinar I'll explain the basics of this 42001 and also what are the implementation steps. And you know, with all of this hype around AI, it's, I would say, a very useful standard to introduce AI governance, and therefore, I would say, introduce additional trustworthiness of AI, which is probably the biggest problem with AI right now. It's not the technological process, is more about whether you trust it or not. And you actually trust it as much as you actually can govern it, right? Govern it. So this is where ISO 42001 is very important. Anyway, you see in the chat window, you can see now these links where you can sign up for this webinar. Good. Now let me see if there are any other questions coming in. Okay, if there are no questions, then let me wrap up the webinar. So just a few words before I finish. You know, this webinar today was really intended to give you an overview of how to set the ISMS scope, and really the intention was not here to, you know, go into details of, I don't know, implementation of controls or, I don't know, doing the risk assessment. But of course, you can use Conformio to speed these things up and to learn actually how to do these things. And yeah, regarding the PDF presentation deck from this webinar, you will actually be able to find it basically on the same page where you're watching the webinar. If you're watching the webinar on LinkedIn and YouTube, you'll be able to see the link to download this presentation deck on the same page where you're watching now. So simply leave this URL open where you're watching the webinar now, and in about 10 minutes you will see in the comment section we'll publish this link for downloading this presentation deck. If you join the webinar through Zoom, then we will send this email with this download link in let's say by tomorrow morning, so you will receive the email. And yeah, you will also see a link to a short survey, so I would appreciate if you would provide your feedback, because if you would fill out this survey, only 3 questions, very quick, I would say maybe 30 seconds, and so this will actually help me, because then I can know what I can improve in the webinars. And this would be all. Thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you have enjoyed this webinar today.